In the year the old era died in England, a man was born who was destined to create a new one. The year was 1642. King Charles I raised his standard at Nottingham, and the country, tearing itself apart, plunged into the abyss of civil war. Puritans and Cavaliers began their bloody harvest, and it seemed as if God himself had turned his back on the land, leaving it at the mercy of plague, prophecies, and fear. On that bleak, dark Christmas, in the tiny hamlet of Woolsthorpe, in the county of Lincolnshire, in a manor house reeking of damp and livestock, a young widow named Hannah Ayscaugh Newton gave premature birth to a son. He was so tiny and frail that, as she later recounted, he could have fit inside a quart mug. No one believed he would survive a day. The midwives had already prepared a shroud for him, while his mother, exhausted from childbirth and grieving her husband who had died 3 months earlier, could only gaze listlessly at the tiny, almost lifeless creature. The boy survived. Against all odds, he clung to life with the same silent, stubborn force with which he would later cling to the secrets of the universe. He was named Isaac after his late father, an illiterate but prosperous farmer whom he would never know. And so this story began, with loneliness. He was born into solitude, in a world consumed by war, under the sign of death, without a father to love, and with a mother whose love would prove to be brief and conditional. The world greeted Isaac Newton not with a lullaby, but with the clash of steel and the foreboding of catastrophe. He would carry this sense of a hostile, unstable world, a world with no reliable foundation, throughout his entire life. He would spend decades searching for that foundation. First in God, then in the secret knowledge of the alchemists, and finally in the immutable, eternal laws that govern the motion of the planets and the fall of an apple. The first 3 years of his life were spent in the shadow of his mother's love. For Hannah, he was everything, a fragile reminder of her husband, the only joy in the gray routine of widowhood. But this idyllic world, barely formed, was shattered. When Isaac was 3, a new man appeared in their home. Barnabas Smith, a wealthy 63-year-old rector from a neighboring parish, proposed to Hannah, but with a condition. He would marry her, but he would not take her son into his home. He had no desire to raise another man's child, and Hannah, a young woman weary of loneliness and hardship, made her choice. She chose a new husband. She left her 3-year-old son in the care of his grandmother and moved into the rectory, just a mile from Woolsthorpe. But for the little boy, that mile became an impassable chasm, a distance equal to betrayal. The day his mother left became Newton's point of no return, the primal trauma that would shape his entire character. He, who had survived against all odds, was rejected by the person closest to him. The feeling of being abandoned, unwanted, and the conviction that the world was a place where no one could be trusted etched itself into his soul like acid. He grew up under the care of his grandmother, a woman who was likely kind but could not replace his mother. He would see her, his mother, on Sundays at church, with her new children, his half-brother and sisters, whom she loved and cared for. Each of these encounters was a silent reproach, a confirmation of his worthlessness. A cold, quiet hatred was born and took root in his young mind. Hatred for his stepfather, who had taken his mother from him, and, most terrifyingly, hatred for the mother who had betrayed him. This hatred was not a fleeting childhood grudge. It was so deep and all-consuming that years later, as a student at Cambridge, While attempting to cleanse his soul before God, he compiled a detailed list of his sins. Among other transgressions, entry number 13 read, "This was no exaggeration. It was the frozen rage of a 3-year-old child who had watched his mother leave and felt something inside him break forever." This betrayal taught him his most important lesson. Emotional attachment brings only pain. And so he would shut himself off from the world. He would build an impenetrable wall around his heart, dedicating his entire life to that which would never betray him. The search for absolute, impersonal, cold, and beautiful truth. He would learn to find solace not in people, but in numbers, not in embraces, but in diagrams, not in love, but in the laws governing the silent dance of the stars. He decided to recreate the world that had rejected him, but in miniature. Loneliness became his workshop, and the feeling of abandonment, the fuel for his intellect. He grew into a quiet, withdrawn boy who preferred the company of things, mechanisms, and drawings to that of other children. While his peers played at war, imitating the adults, or kicked a ball, Isaac retreated into himself, into his own world, where everything obeyed logic and order, where there was no room for betrayal or disappointment. He was not a prodigy in the conventional sense. At the primary school in a nearby village, his performance was mediocre. He often daydreamed, annoying his teachers with his absent-mindedness. His mind was wired differently. He did not absorb ready-made knowledge. He dissected reality, trying to understand how it worked. His first scientific treatises were not books, but handmade contraptions. He would spend hours observing the village windmill, studying how the wind turned the sails, which in turn moved the heavy millstones. But it was not enough for him to simply watch. He had to replicate this marvel. In a shed, among dusty tools, armed with a saw and a knife, he built a precise working model of the windmill. It was so perfect that it even had its own miniature millstones that could grind a handful of grain into flour. And when there was no wind, the mill was powered by a tin mouse he placed inside a wheel, enticing it to run with crumbs. This was more than a toy. It was his first act of creation. He had taken a chaotic force of nature, the wind, and confined it within a mechanism he could understand. Time became his second obsession. He did not trust clocks, which could stop or run fast. He decided to measure time himself, directly from its source, the sun. He dotted the yard and the walls of the house with pegs, creating a complex system of sundials that showed not only the hours, but also the equinoxes and solstices. He learned to tell time by the shadow of his own body. It was his attempt to bring order to the most relentless and uncontrollable of all human processes. If he could predict where a shadow would be in an hour, it meant there was, after all, some order in the world, some predictability. He was creating his own reliable reality to replace the one that had caused him so much pain. His inventions often frightened the superstitious villagers. One night, he built a large kite, attached a paper lantern with a lit candle inside, and launched it into the dark sky. The flickering, mysterious light floating among the stars caused a panic in the village. People thought it was a comet, a harbinger of new misfortunes and plagues. For Isaac, it was just another experiment, an attempt to understand the laws of flight, a game of the mind, in which he was the sole participant and spectator. He had not meant to scare anyone. He simply did not think about other people. To him, they were just part of the external, unpredictable, and often hostile world. In his universe, there existed only himself and the laws of nature he was trying to decipher. When he was 12, he was sent to the King's School in Grantham to study Latin, Greek, and the Bible. He lodged at the home of the local apothecary, Mr. Clark. This proved to be his salvation. For the first time in his life, he was in an environment where knowledge was valued. The apothecary's house was filled with wondrous things. Rows of jars with mysterious powders and liquids, thick books with formulas and recipes, and instruments he had never seen before. Here he found what he had been missing: nourishment for his perpetually hungry mind. He devoured books on chemistry, drew complex diagrams of birds and ships on his bedroom walls, and, most importantly, he could talk for hours with Mr. Clark and his wife about things that were incomprehensible and uninteresting to anyone in his home village. It was at the school in Grantham that an incident occurred which, by his own account, changed him forever. Initially, he was one of the worst students in his class, lost in his own thoughts and paying little attention to his studies. But one day, on the way to school, he was badly beaten by another boy, the top student in the class. The humiliation was twofold: physical and intellectual. Isaac, being weaker, could not retaliate with force. So he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He resolved to crush his tormentor on his own turf, academics. He threw all his energy into his books. He ceased being a mere dreamer and became a fighter. Within a few months, he had not only caught up with, but surpassed all his classmates to become the top student. This was his first taste of intellectual warfare, and he discovered that the victory was sweeter than any other. From that moment on, he could never be second. He had to be first. Anyone who challenged his primacy automatically became an enemy to be destroyed. But this newfound world of knowledge was soon threatened. When he was 17, his stepfather, Barnabas Smith, died. His mother returned to Woolsthorpe with her 3 children from her second marriage and decided it was time for her eldest son to stop his foolishness. She pulled him out of school. The future greatest scientist in human history was to become a farmer. For Isaac, this was a catastrophe, a return to the hell he had so desperately tried to escape. He was forced to tend sheep, plow the fields, and go to the market. He hated this work. He sabotaged it in every way he could. Instead of watching the livestock, he would sit under a tree and read the books he had secretly brought from Grantham. On the way to the market, he would leave a servant to handle the trading, while he went off into the fields to build his models and solve problems. His mother was furious. A quiet, stubborn war raged between them. She tried to force him back into the real world, and he just as stubbornly escaped into the world of ideas. His fate was decided by his schoolmaster, Mr. Stokes, and his mother's brother, William Iscoff. They saw in this strange, obstinate youth not just a lazy boy, but something more. They traveled to Woolsthorpe and spent hours convincing Hannah that forcing Isaac to plow a field was like trying to harness a racehorse to a plow. They begged her to let him return to school to prepare for university. Seeing that she would never make a farmer out of her son, Hannah finally, grudgingly, agreed. For Newton, it was a triumph. He had won his right to knowledge. In the summer of 1661, at the age of 19, Isaac Newton left Woolsthorpe for Cambridge, to the renowned Trinity College. He had escaped. He thought he was heading to a temple of science, a realm of pure thought, but reality proved to be far more prosaic and humiliating. He was admitted as a Caesar, the poorest class of student, who had to pay for his education by serving as a valet to wealthier students, cleaning their boots, tidying their rooms, and serving their meals. This stigma of poverty and social humiliation only fueled his already white-hot ambition. He would prove to them all, his mother, his stepfather, the school bullies, the wealthy students, that he was better than them. He would become the greatest of them all, and the entire world would bow to the power of his mind. Cambridge greeted him not with an embrace, but with indifference. He was just one of hundreds of new students, a grain of sand in the ancient machinery of the university. But for Newton, this place was an entire universe. The majestic Gothic buildings of Trinity College, whose spires seemed to pierce the very heavens. Its vast library holding the wisdom of ages. The very atmosphere steeped in knowledge. All of it both thrilled and overwhelmed him. His humiliating status as a Caesar forced him to keep to the shadows. He was an invisible man, a ghost who glided through the corridors, performing his servant's duties before disappearing into his tiny chamber. He sought no friends and took no part in student revelries. His only companions were books. He soon discovered that the official university curriculum was hopelessly outdated. While the world was buzzing with new ideas, Cambridge was still dominated by Aristotle. Students were forced to study scholasticism and memorize the works of the ancient Greeks, whose views of the world were elegant but largely incorrect. They were taught that the earth was the center of the universe, that celestial bodies moved in perfect circles, and that heavy objects fell faster than light ones. For most students, it was just a required course to be passed and forgotten. But for Newton, it was unbearable. His mind, accustomed to questioning and dissecting everything, rebelled against the blind acceptance of dogma. And so he began his own secret curriculum. By day, he was a diligent student of Aristotle. By night, by candlelight, he plunged into the forbidden, revolutionary world of the new science. He acquired books that were not on the official reading list. He read René Descartes' Geometry and was stunned by the power of his analytical method, which described space with equations. He studied the works of Johannes Kepler, who, after analyzing mountains of observations, had proven that planets move not in circles, but in ellipses. He read Galileo Galilei's dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, which, with the aid of a telescope, revealed mountains on the moon and the moons of Jupiter, shattering the notion of perfect and immutable heavens. These were books that turned the world upside down. Newton did not just read. He engaged in a dialogue with these great minds in the pages of his notebooks. He kept a thick folio he titled Questiones Quaedam Philosophicae. On the title page, he wrote the motto, "This was his personal declaration of independence." In this notebook, he recorded everything that official science could not explain. He compiled lists of dozens of questions on every topic. Is light a particle or a wave? What holds the planets in their orbits? What is gravity? Why do objects fall to Earth? These were the very questions that would define his entire scientific career. He devoured knowledge, outstripping his peers and even his professors by decades. He was an intellectual Robinson Crusoe, single-handedly exploring a whole new continent of thought. His only friend and mentor during this period was the mathematics professor Isaac Barrow, one of the few at Cambridge who understood that a new science, based on mathematics and experiment, was replacing the old. Barrow noticed this strange, silent student whose mind worked with frightening speed and depth. He gave him books, discussed the most complex mathematical problems with him, and was likely the first person to grasp the true scale of the genius hidden behind the humble facade of a Caesar. It was under Barrow's influence that Newton immersed himself in higher mathematics, and it was here that his genius truly shone. He did not just solve existing problems. He began to create his own mathematical tools. He felt that the existing language of mathematics was too cumbersome to describe a world in motion, a world of constantly changing quantities. He needed a new language, and so he began to create it. In the summer of 1665, this quiet, secluded life was brutally interrupted. The plague arrived from London. The Great Plague, the Black Death, spread across the country, claiming tens of thousands of lives. Cities emptied as people fled in terror, locking themselves in their homes. Cambridge University was closed, and all students and professors were sent home indefinitely. For most, it was an unfortunate disruption. For 23-year-old Isaac Newton, forced to return to his hated Woolsthorpe estate, this exile became the greatest gift of fate. He had left Cambridge as a brilliant but unknown student. He would return as a man who, alone and in the silence of the countryside, would make more scientific discoveries than all of humanity had in the previous 2,000 years. These 18 months of forced isolation would go down in history as his Annus Mirabilis, his year of wonders. The world plunged into the darkness of the plague, but in the mind of one man, sitting in a garden in Woolsthorpe, the light of a new universe was dawning. Woolsthorpe greeted him with silence and old ghosts. He was back in the very house that symbolized his childhood betrayal and humiliation. But he was different now. He had returned not as a broken boy, but as a young man whose mind was white-hot with ideas that could change the world. The isolation that was a curse for others became a blessing for him. Here, there were no Caesar's duties, no boring lectures, no one to distract him from the great work unfolding within his mind. The world held its breath, waiting for the plague to end, while Newton, free from all constraints, plunged into the most productive period of intellectual creation in human history. The first fortress to fall was mathematics. The problem that had stumped the greatest minds in Europe was how to describe motion and change. How could one mathematically describe the ever-changing velocity of a cannonball? How could one find the area of a curved shape? The old geometry of Euclid was static. It worked perfectly for stationary objects, but failed before the dynamics of the real world. Newton needed a tool to work with, his term for continuously changing quantities. And so he created it. In the quiet of his room, filling stack after stack of paper, he laid the foundations of what we now call differential and integral calculus. He developed his quote, which allowed him to find the instantaneous velocity of any object at any point in its trajectory, and, conversely, to reconstruct the path taken from its velocity. This was not just a breakthrough. It was the creation of a new mathematical language, the language in which all future science would be spoken. He did this at the age of 23, in complete solitude, and told no one of his discovery. It was merely a tool he would need to solve more global problems. The second secret he resolved to wrest from nature was the mystery of light. What is light? What are colors made of? Aristotle had taught that color was a mixture of light and darkness. White light was considered pure and primordial, while the colors of the rainbow were its quote, or quote. This explanation did not satisfy Newton. It was too vague, too philosophical. He needed proof. In his darkened room, he made a tiny hole in a shutter, allowing a single, thin beam of sunlight to enter. In the path of this beam, he placed a glass prism he had bought at a fair. And a miracle occurred, one that others had seen before. The prism split the white beam into a brilliant band of all the colors of the rainbow, a spectrum. But Newton went further. He was not content with a beautiful effect. He began to ask questions. Were these colors a product of the prism itself, as everyone believed? Or were they inherent in the white light? To find out, he conducted his famous Experimentum Crucis. He placed a screen with another small hole in the path of the spectrum, allowing only a single color, such as red, to pass through. Then he placed a second prism in the path of this red beam. According to the old theory, the second prism should have the red light even further, changing it into something else. But nothing happened. The same pure red beam emerged from the second prism. The experiment proved irrefutably that colors are not created by the prism. It merely separates them, like a sieve. All the colors of the rainbow are originally contained within white sunlight. White is not purity, but a mixture. This discovery completely overturned a 2,000-year-old doctrine. But even this was not enough for him. He placed the second prism upside down and recombined all the colors of the spectrum back into a single beam. And that beam was perfectly white again. The circle was complete. The mystery of light was solved. And finally, the third and greatest mystery, the motion of the planets. The legend, later embellished by Newton himself, tells of him sitting in his garden at Woolsthorpe when he saw an apple fall from a tree. In that moment, he had an epiphany. Why does an apple fall down, not sideways or up? Clearly, the earth is pulling it. But how far does this force of attraction extend? To the top of the tree? Perhaps higher, to the mountain tops. What if it extends all the way to the moon? And then a brilliant thought flashed in his mind. Perhaps the very same force that makes the apple fall also holds the moon in its orbit, preventing it from flying off into space. The moon, in essence, is also constantly toward the earth, but because of its great tangential velocity, it continually remaining in a circular orbit. This was a hypothesis of breathtaking audacity. It united two worlds that had previously been considered entirely separate and subject to different laws. The terrestrial world, where everything falls, and the celestial world, where planets revolve eternally in perfect paths. Newton proposed that they were one and the same world, governed by one and the same universal law. He took up his new mathematical tool, the method of fluxions, and began to calculate. He knew the distance to the moon and its orbital speed. He could calculate the acceleration required to keep it in orbit. He then calculated the acceleration with which the apple falls to the ground. If his theory was correct, the force of gravity must weaken with the square of the distance. Knowing how many times farther the moon is from the Earth's center than the apple, he could compare the two values. His initial calculations did not match perfectly. He had used slightly inaccurate data for the Earth's radius. But the result was so close that he knew he was on the right track. He had found the invisible strings that bind the entire universe together. In 18 months, while his country writhed in the agony of the plague, this young man, in complete isolation from the scientific world, in the quiet of the countryside, single-handedly made three of the greatest discoveries in history. He created calculus, unraveled the nature of light, and formulated the foundations of the law of universal gravitation. He told no one. He placed his papers in a chest. The work was done. When the plague subsided in 1667 and the university reopened its doors, he returned to Cambridge. No one knew that this modest, unknown young man, returning to continue his education, already carried in his head the complete framework of a new world. Returning to Cambridge, Newton once again receded into the shadows. He did not trumpet his discoveries from the rooftops. His reclusive, distrustful nature and his fear of criticism compelled him to keep his revolutionary ideas to himself. He was like a dragon hoarding a treasure, unwilling to share it with anyone. Only a few, including his patron Isaac Barrow, suspected the true scale of his genius. It was Barrow who, upon deciding to leave his professorship in mathematics to devote himself to theology, took an unprecedented step. He insisted that his successor be this unknown 26-year-old. And so, in 1669, Isaac Newton became the Lucasian Professor of Mathematics, one of the most prestigious academic posts in the world. The man who was once a student servant had now become one of the youngest professors in Cambridge's history. Having achieved official status, Newton could no longer completely hide his work. His first lectures on optics, delivered to an almost empty room, already contained the foundations of his new theory of light and color. But the lectures were too complex for the students, and his ideas remained the property of a small, initiated circle. His breakthrough into the wider world came thanks to his second passion, building telescopes. The existing refracting telescopes, which used lenses, suffered from a serious flaw known as chromatic aberration. A colored fringe appeared around bright objects, blurring the view. Newton, based on his theory that white light is composed of different colors that refract at different angles, concluded that this defect was insurmountable. He proposed a radical solution. Use a concave mirror instead of a lens. In his small laboratory, which more closely resembled an alchemist's cell, he single-handedly built the world's first functioning reflecting telescope. He personally developed a new alloy for the mirror, a mix of copper, tin, and arsenic, and cast and polished it himself to a perfect parabolic shape. His telescope was tiny, only 6 inches long, but it provided a clearer and more powerful magnification than cumbersome refracting telescopes several feet in length. In late 1671, this small, unassuming instrument was demonstrated in London at a meeting of the Royal Society, England's premier scientific institution. The effect was explosive. The learned men were ecstatic. They could see Jupiter's moons and the phases of Venus with unprecedented clarity. Isaac Newton's name instantly became known throughout the scientific world. He was triumphantly elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. Emboldened by this success, Newton did what he had so long avoided. He decided to share his main discovery in optics with the world. In 1672, he sent a letter to the Royal Society detailing his new theory of light and color, supported by a description of he expected acclaim and applause. Instead, he received a firestorm of criticism, misunderstanding, and outright hostility. His ideas were too revolutionary. They contradicted everything that had been taught for centuries. But his chief opponent, his first mortal enemy in the world of science, was the man who had been considered England's foremost authority on experimental physics. His name was Robert Hooke. Hooke was Newton's polar opposite. Where Newton was a reclusive, morose hermit, Hooke was a man of the world, a brilliant polemicist, and the curator of experiments for the Royal Society. He was a polymath, an architect, inventor, biologist, and physicist. He had improved the microscope and was the first to see and describe a cell. He had formulated the law of elasticity. He was also vain, envious, and intolerant of any competition in his field. And now this upstart from Cambridge had dared to challenge his own theories of light. Hooke believed light was a wave, and that colors arose from its modification. He immediately attacked Newton's work with sharp dismissive criticism, claiming that Newton's ideas were not new and his experiments proved nothing. For Newton, whose pathological intolerance for criticism stemmed from his childhood traumas, this was a declaration of war. He perceived any doubt of his correctness not as a scientific debate, but as a personal insult, an assault on his intellectual superiority. He could not and would not argue. He wanted to annihilate. A fierce correspondence erupted between England's two greatest minds in the pages of scientific journals. Newton, with cold, mathematical precision, dismantled all of Hooke's objections point by point. Hooke responded with new, even more scathing attacks. The dispute, which lasted for several years, exhausted Newton. He was not prepared for public battles. He wrote in despair. He was so crushed and disillusioned that he made a fateful decision. He withdrew into himself once more. He vowed never again to publish his discoveries. The world of science had proven to be not a temple of truth, but a viper's nest of envy and intrigue. He wanted nothing more to do with it. He locked himself away again in his Cambridge cell. But his mind could not rest. If the world of physics had brought him such suffering, he would turn to another, more mysterious and ancient form of knowledge. He delved into a world that would become his secret passion, his dark side. He immersed himself completely in alchemy. Slamming the door of his laboratory on the world, Newton began a double life. To the few students and professors at Cambridge, he was the Lucasian professor of mathematics, a reclusive and unsociable genius lost in his calculations. But at night, when the college slept, he became the last of the great magicians, an adept of a secret art that the Church considered heresy and the nascent scientific community a shameful superstition. He became an alchemist. In a small shed behind his garden, he built a laboratory, a true temple of esoteric knowledge. There, far from prying eyes, he installed several furnaces that he kept burning day and night. The shelves were lined with retorts, flasks, alembics, and dozens of jars containing mysterious substances: mercury, antimony, lead, arsenic. The air was thick with acrid fumes, and the walls were covered in soot from his endless experiments. To the modern mind, Newton's obsession with alchemy seems a shocking paradox. How could the man who created the rational mechanics of the universe believe in turning lead into gold, or in the existence of a philosopher's stone that granted immortality? But for Newton, there was no paradox. To him, science and alchemy were not opposites, but two different paths to the same goal: knowing God. He believed that God had created the world based on hidden, harmonious principles, and had left the key to understanding them in two great books: the Book of Nature, which could be read through mathematics and experiment, and the Holy Scripture, which he believed was encoded and required mystical interpretation. He saw alchemy as a third, most secret path, a sacred science of transformation, inherited from ancient sages, perhaps from Moses and Solomon themselves. He bought every alchemical treatise he could find, amassing one of the world's largest libraries on the subject. He did not just read them, he copied them by hand, trying to decipher their obscure, symbolic language. He believed that behind these metaphors lay real chemical recipes, encrypted to protect them from the profane. He was convinced that the ancients possessed knowledge that had been lost, and that his mission was to revive it. His laboratory notebooks, written in a mixture of Latin, English, and cryptic symbols, attest to his obsession. He would spend up to 6 weeks at a time by his furnaces, forgetting to eat or sleep, watching the slow transformation of substances in his retorts. He inhaled toxic mercury vapors, which slowly but surely poisoned his nervous system, likely contributing to his later mental breakdowns. His primary goal was not to create gold for wealth. That would have been too crude for a man of his stature. He was interested in the secret of transformation itself. He sought the primordial substance from which, he believed, the entire material world was created. Whoever could isolate this substance could control matter itself. He conducted hundreds of experiments, mixing antimony, iron, and mercury, trying to create the crystalline structure that alchemists considered the key to the great work. It was grueling, often fruitless labor, but Newton approached it with the same methodical persistence he applied to optics or mathematics. Alongside alchemy, he immersed himself in another secret domain, theology and chronology. He learned Hebrew to read the Bible in its original language. He was convinced that biblical texts, especially the book of Daniel and the Apocalypse, contained coded prophecies about the future of humanity. He filled thousands of pages attempting to calculate the exact date of creation, the crucifixion, and, most importantly, the second coming and the end of the world. His calculations, based on complex comparisons of biblical verses and historical events, led him to conclude that the apocalypse would not occur before the year 2060. He believed this as firmly as he believed in his laws of motion. Furthermore, his deep study of early Christian texts led him to a dangerous heresy. He concluded that the doctrine of the Holy Trinity, the equality of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, was a later corruption introduced by the Church in the 4th century. He became a secret Arian, believing that Christ was divine but not equal to God the Father. In 17th century England, this was a crime punishable not only by the loss of his professorship, but also by imprisonment, or even death. He carefully concealed his views, confiding them only to his secret manuscripts. The man who is today an icon of scientific rationalism was secretly a heretic, a mystic, and an alchemist, living in a world of prophecies, secret codes, and anticipation of the world's end. He spent 20 years in this self-imposed exile, torn between the world of light and the world of darkness. He published almost no scientific work, jealously guarding his discoveries from prying eyes. The world began to forget the brilliant young professor who had once dazzled everyone with his telescope, and he might have remained a reclusive genius in history had it not been for a visitor who, in August 1684, knocked on his door in Cambridge. The man's name was Edmund Halley, and his visit would change everything. He had come to ask Newton a single question that tormented the entire scientific community, a question upon whose answer the fate of science depended. He did not know that the answer had been lying in a locked chest in this strange, unsociable man's room for 20 years. Edmund Halley's visit was an act of desperation. Halley, a young and energetic astronomer and a fellow of the Royal Society, was obsessed with the same puzzle as many of his contemporaries. What force keeps the planets in motion? Thanks to Kepler, it was known that planets moved in ellipses. But why? What force governed this celestial dance? In London, Halley often discussed this with 2 other brilliant minds, the aforementioned Robert Hooke and Sir Christopher Wren, the great architect rebuilding London after the Great Fire. All three suspected the answer lay in a force inversely proportional to the square of the distance. That is, the farther a planet is from the sun, the weaker the attraction, in a precise mathematical relationship. Hooke even boasted that he had long ago solved the problem, but refused to provide his calculations, wishing to keep them secret. Halley and Wren found his claims to be empty boasts. No one could prove it mathematically. Then Halley remembered the strange professor from Cambridge. He had heard of his mathematical genius and decided to try his luck. He traveled to Cambridge and appeared at Newton's door unannounced. After some awkward greetings, Halley posed his question directly. "Dr. Newton, what curve would the planets describe if we suppose that the force of attraction towards the sun is reciprocally as the square of their distance from it?" Without a moment's hesitation, Newton replied. Halley was stunned and overjoyed. Newton's next words astonished Halley even more. "Why, I have calculated it," he answered casually. He began to rummage through his papers, but could not find the relevant sheet amidst the chaos of alchemical treatises, theological notes, and mathematical calculations. He nonchalantly promised Halley he would look for the calculations and send them along later. Halley left, puzzled and intrigued. He could not believe that this man had, as if in passing, solved the greatest mystery of the age, and then simply misplaced the proof in a pile of papers. But for Newton, the visit was a catalyst. Halley's question awakened the sleeping giant within him. He found his old calculations rechecked them, corrected the errors made due to inaccurate data on the Earth's radius, and confirmed that everything fit perfectly. A few months later, he sent Halley not just a brief proof, but a short treatise titled On the Motion of Bodies in an Orbit. When Halley received this work, he knew he was holding something incredible. It was not just the solution to a single problem. It was the foundation of a completely new celestial mechanics. He immediately returned to Cambridge and began to implore Newton to expand on these ideas and publish them as a full-fledged book under the auspices of the Royal Society. At first, Newton refused. He remembered the humiliating dispute with Hooke and had no desire to re-enter the fray of public debate. But Halley was not only a brilliant scientist, but also a skilled diplomat. He flattered Newton, argued that it was his duty to humanity, and, most importantly, promised to handle all the troubles of publication himself. Then something happened that tipped the scales. Robert Hooke, hearing of Newton's work, renewed his claims, declaring that he, Hooke, had first discovered the inverse square law, and that Newton had simply stolen his idea. This was the last straw. The rage Newton felt for his old enemy flared with new intensity. He decided not just to publish his results, but to create a work so titanic and comprehensive that it would crush all his opponents once and for all, and show the world who was the true king of science. He accepted the challenge. The next 18 months became a period of almost superhuman intellectual labor. Newton locked himself in his rooms, completely cut off from the outside world. He barely slept, working 18 to 20 hours a day. He forgot to eat. Legend has it his cat grew fat from eating the untouched meals left for him. He filled thousands of pages, often standing at a tall desk, and when one sheet was full, he would grab the next without pausing. This was not just work. It was a sacred act of creation. He was not merely writing down old ideas. His thoughts surged forward at an incredible pace, opening up new horizons. He began with 3 simple laws of motion that every schoolchild knows today. The law of inertia, the law that force is proportional to acceleration, and the law of equal and opposite reactions. Then, armed with these axioms and his powerful mathematical apparatus, he derived from them the entire mechanics of the universe. He mathematically proved not only that planets move in ellipses, but also explained the motion of comets, the mechanism of tides, and predicted the flattening of the Earth at the poles. He united heaven and earth under the dominion of a single, universal law, the law of universal gravitation. Every body in the universe attracts every other body with a force directly proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. Everything, from the fall of an apple to the dance of the most distant stars, obeyed this simple and elegant equation. When the manuscript was nearly complete, the Royal Society, which had initially promised to fund the publication, suddenly went bankrupt, having spent all its money on printing a lavish but unwanted treatise, The History of Fishes. It seemed the greatest work in the history of science would never see the light of day. It was then that Edmund Halley performed an act that would forever enshrine his name in history. Though not a wealthy man, he decided to publish the book at his own expense. He personally edited the manuscript, supervised the engravers and printers, and corrected the proofs. On July 5, 1687, the book, titled Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, or simply the Principia, was published. The world was changed forever. The universe, which had been a place of mystery governed by the whims of God or angels, was now revealed as a giant, perfect clockwork mechanism, operating according to precise, predictable, and knowable laws. Newton had given humanity the instruction manual for this universe. But the creator of this new worldview found no peace in it. Having completed his Titanic Labor, he found himself on the edge of an abyss. Years of superhuman strain, sleepless nights, and possible poisoning from toxic fumes in his alchemical laboratory had brought him to the point of complete exhaustion. His mind, which had touched the stars, was about to collapse into madness. The publication of the Principia brought Newton neither joy nor relief. It left only a scorched wasteland in its wake. The mountain he had climbed for so long had been conquered, and before him lay only emptiness. He had given this book everything, his strength, his time, his mind. And now that the work was done, he was hollowed out. The book was met by the scientific world with reverent awe, but only a few in Europe were capable of understanding its complex mathematical language. To most, it was a revelation written in the language of the gods. Newton was celebrated, but he remained as lonely as ever. Fame was cold and impersonal. It could not fill the void in his soul. Other blows followed. In 1689, he was elected to Parliament as a representative for Cambridge University. It was a recognition of his new status, but he found the world of politics alien and repulsive. He faithfully attended sessions, but according to legend, spoke only once during the entire year, to ask a servant to close a window because of a draft. The intrigues, compromises, and empty chatter of London society filled him with contempt. He felt like an outsider, a genius being forced to play children's games. His one attempt at a romantic relationship with the niece of a friend also came to nothing. The wall he had built around his heart in childhood proved too thick. The true blow that pushed him to the brink came in 1692 and 1693. His already fragile nervous system, exhausted by titanic work and years of inhaling mercury and lead vapors in his alchemical laboratory, began to fail. His paranoia, which had smoldered beneath the surface, erupted with monstrous force. He began to see enemies and conspiracies everywhere. He imagined that his friends, the few people he trusted, were plotting against him, trying to steal his work or ruin his reputation. He began to suffer from severe insomnia that lasted for weeks, and a distemper of the head that affected his memory. His mind, capable of holding the mechanics of the entire universe, now struggled with everyday tasks. The crisis culminated in his mad letters, which he sent to two of his closest friends, the philosopher John Locke and the diarist Samuel Pepys. In his letter to Locke, he wrote, "Sir, being of opinion that you endeavored to embroil me with women and by other means, I was so much affected with it that when one told me you were sickly and would not live, I answered, 'Twere better if you were dead. I desire you to forgive me this uncharitableness." In an even stranger letter to Pepys, he announced he could no longer see him because he had neither ate nor slept well this 12-month, nor have I my former consistency of mind. These letters, filled with paranoid accusations and desperate confessions, shocked his friends. They realized that the greatest mind in England was on the verge of a complete collapse. What caused this black year? Historians still debate the cause. The most likely theory is chronic heavy metal poisoning. Analysis of Newton's preserved hair has shown levels of mercury, lead, and arsenic tens of times higher than normal. He had literally poisoned himself in his pursuit of alchemical secrets. Others believe it was a classic nervous breakdown brought on by superhuman overexertion and subsequent depression. It is also possible that a fire in his laboratory, which according to one story destroyed some of his manuscripts, played a role, representing an irreplaceable loss. Whatever the cause, the fact remains. For 2 years, Isaac Newton virtually disappeared from life, plunging into the darkness of his own mind. He recovered, slowly, with the help of his friends, who, despite his crazed letters, did not abandon him. He began to return to himself. But the crisis changed him forever. Something within him had broken. He no longer could, or wanted to, pursue pure science with the same obsession as before. His greatest discoveries were behind him. He was 50 years old, a living legend, yet still a poor Cambridge professor locked in his ivory tower. He craved change. He wanted power, recognition, and wealth. He wanted to leave Cambridge for London, the center of the world. His influential friends decided to help him. They understood that it was a crime to let such a mind languish in a university. Charles Montague, a former student of Newton's, who had become Chancellor of the Exchequer, offered him a position. It was not an honorary sinecure typically given to celebrated scholars. It was a real job, hard, dirty, and dangerous. Montague offered Newton the post of Warden of the Royal Mint. At the time, the English economy was on the brink of collapse. The country was in chaos due to the widespread clipping and counterfeiting of coins. Old silver coins, made by hand, had been so trimmed at the edges by swindlers that their real value was half their face value. The nation faced financial catastrophe. The government initiated a massive reform, the Great Recoinage, to replace all old coins with new, machine-milled ones with a ridged edge that could not be clipped undetected. To bring order to the corrupt and criminalized institution that was the mint, Montague needed a man of iron will, absolute integrity, and a ruthless mind. He gambled on Newton. In 1696, Isaac Newton left Cambridge, where he had lived for 35 years, and moved to London. He exchanged his professor's gown for the coat of a civil servant. Many thought it would be a mere figurehead position for him, a quiet harbor. They could not have imagined what a man whose mind was accustomed to getting to the bottom of everything and whose hatred of chaos and deceit was almost pathological would make of this job. The world's greatest scientist, the creator of celestial mechanics, was about to descend into the darkest dens of the London underworld. He was about to become a hunter. The Tower of London at the end of the 17th century was a grim place, steeped in the memory of centuries of conspiracies, torture, and executions. And it was here, within its walls, that the Royal Mint was located. It was not just a manufacturing facility, but a veritable snake pit. Corruption was rampant at every level. Workers stole precious metals, officials took bribes, and the coining technology itself was so outdated it could not cope with the task at hand. When Newton arrived, he entered a world that was the complete opposite of the quiet halls of Cambridge. This place smelled of hot metal and human greed. And Newton, whom everyone considered a bookish scholar incapable of practical work, took on the task with an energy and ruthlessness that shocked everyone. He did not sit in an office signing papers. He began as he always did, with a total, exhaustive study of the problem. He spent days and nights at the facility, personally overseeing every stage of the process, from weighing ingots and testing alloys to operating the presses. He wrote detailed reports, calculating with mathematical precision the productivity of each machine and each worker. He developed new, more accurate methods for assaying the purity of metal, transforming the mint into a vast chemical laboratory. Within months, he had brought an order to the institution it had never known. Under his leadership, the mint's productivity increased several times over, and the great recoinage, which had been stalling, finally moved into full swing. But restoring internal order was only half the battle. The main threat to the nation's financial system came from counterfeiters. London was flooded with fake money. Entire gangs, from small-time crooks to major criminal syndicates, plied this trade, undermining the economy while remaining virtually unpunished. The investigation of these crimes was supposed to be handled by local authorities, who were either incompetent or corrupt themselves. Newton, who a few years later became not just Warden but Master of the Mint, was also granted the powers of a justice of the peace. He decided to take this war into his own hands. He turned his office into the headquarters of his own secret service. He used his own money to hire a network of informants and spies, whom he embedded in the darkest corners of London's underworld. His agents worked in dockside taverns, gambling dens, and brothels, gathering rumors and tracking the distribution channels for counterfeit money. Newton personally analyzed their reports, mapping out criminal networks, identifying their leaders and weak points. He transformed himself from a theoretical physicist into the world's first forensic scientist. He studied fake coins under a microscope, analyzing the composition of the alloy and the features of the strike to identify the signature work of different gangs. He was relentless. But he was no mere armchair detective. He personally participated in operations. Disguised in plain clothes, he went to the most notorious parts of the city, mingling with crowds in markets and pubs, listening to conversations, and gaining the trust of petty criminals. The man whose mind had grasped the laws of the universe now studied the habits of the London underworld with the same cold attention. When he had enough evidence, he acted ruthlessly. He personally wrote out arrest warrants and then conducted the interrogations himself. In the dungeons of the Tower, where the spirit of medieval torture still lingered, Isaac Newton, the world's greatest scientist, looked into the eyes of hardened criminals and methodically, step by step, extracted their confessions. He did not use torture. It was, by then, illegal. His weapon was his intellect. He ensnared them in the web of their own lies, turned accomplices against each other, and promised pardons in exchange for testimony against the ringleaders. He was a merciless and brilliant interrogator. In just a few years, he completely turned the tide. Before his arrival at the Mint, successful prosecutions against counterfeiters were rare. Under his leadership, hundreds of criminals were arrested and convicted. Dozens of them were sentenced to death by hanging, the standard punishment for high treason, which counterfeiting was considered. Newton personally attended many of the executions, watching with cold satisfaction as his enemies were sent to the gallows. He had no compassion for them. To him, these people were not lost souls, but sources of chaos, flaws in the great mechanism of the state that had to be corrected. He fought them with the same passion with which he fought incorrect theories in science. But among the hundreds of small-time crooks and mid-level thugs, there was one man who became for Newton what Robert Hooke had been in the world of science. His personal nemesis, his criminal genius, his Moriarty. This man's name was William Challoner. William Challoner was no ordinary criminal. He was an artist of the underworld, a man of brilliant intellect, incredible audacity, and boundless vanity. Born into poverty, he started as an apprentice to a draper, but quickly realized that honest work was not for him. He possessed many talents. He was a skilled engraver, knew metallurgy, had a gift for persuasion, and had connections in all layers of society, from dockside prostitutes to members of Parliament. He was a virtuoso con man. He organized lotteries, practiced medicine by selling quack remedies, and, of course, counterfeited money. But he did not just counterfeit it. He elevated it to a high art. His fake guineas and shillings were so perfect that even the experts at the Mint could not distinguish them from the real thing. He created his own underground empire, becoming the most successful and elusive counterfeiter in England. But his greatest talent was his brazenness. Instead of hiding in the shadows, Challoner craved fame. He lived a lavish lifestyle, dressed like an aristocrat, wrote pamphlets and poems, and even managed to testify before Parliament, where, posing as a patriot and an expert, he exposed the flaws in the Mint's operations. In essence, he was publicly accusing Newton and his department of incompetence, while simultaneously flooding the country with his own forgeries. He was taunting the lion, poking a stick into its very den. He did not just want to be rich. He wanted to humiliate the system. He wanted to prove that he, William Challoner, was smarter than all the aristocrats and learned men. And his main target was Isaac Newton himself. For Newton, this became personal. Challoner was not just a criminal. He was his criminal doppelganger, his dark reflection. He was the embodiment of everything Newton hated: chaos, deceit, and intellectual pride put to the service of evil. If Hooke had tried to challenge his primacy in the world of ideas, Challoner was challenging his authority in the real world, and Newton accepted the challenge. Catching Challoner became his obsession, his last great quest. He set aside all other matters and focused the full force of his spy network on this one man. A complex intellectual duel began. Challoner was incredibly cunning. He never worked with his own hands, using a network of apprentices, and constantly moved his clandestine workshops. He knew how to cover his tracks and bribe witnesses. Newton tried to arrest him several times, but each time Challoner managed to wriggle free. He used his connections in Parliament, feigned madness, and gave false testimony against his accomplices, portraying himself as an innocent victim. He seemed to mock Newton, showing that his genius was powerless against street smarts and corruption. But Newton did not give up. He proceeded with his usual methodical persistence. He gathered evidence, interrogated dozens of petty criminals, and one by one picked off the people in Challoner's circle. He pressured them, threatened them with the gallows, and promised pardons. And slowly, link by link, he began to unravel the web. The key was turning one of Challoner's main accomplices, who, finding himself in prison and facing execution, agreed to give a full confession against his boss in exchange for his own life. Newton had what he needed, a direct witness who could describe the entire counterfeiting process and Challoner's role in it. In February 1699, William Challoner was arrested for the last time. This time, Newton had irrefutable proof and ironclad witnesses. The trial was a sensation. Challoner defended himself, delivering brilliant speeches, accusing Newton of personal vengeance and conspiracy. He appealed to justice, quoted the Bible, and tried to win the jury's pity. But his eloquence was powerless against the evidence Newton had amassed. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death. Even on death row, Challoner did not surrender. He wrote desperate letters to everyone he could, including Newton himself, begging for a pardon. He offered to reveal the names of other counterfeiters and promised to serve the state. But Newton was adamant. For him, there could be no mercy. This man was not just a criminal. He was a heresiarch in his new religion of order, and he had to be destroyed. Newton personally ensured that none of Challoner's petitions reached the king. On March 22, 1699, William Challoner was taken to Tyburn, London's main site of public execution. He was hanged, and then, as per the sentence for high treason, drawn and quartered. Newton had won. His greatest enemy was destroyed. The war on chaos was won. Isaac Newton, the father of modern science, the man who discovered the laws of the universe, had also proven to be the most effective and ruthless law enforcement chief in English history. This victory was the final chord in his active, combative life. He had brought order to the mint, secured the nation's financial system, and become a wealthy and powerful man. In 1703, he was elected president of the Royal Society, and here, as everywhere else, he behaved as an absolute monarch. As president of the Royal Society, Newton wielded absolute power over the world of British science, and he ruled it like a tyrant. The same fear of criticism that had once driven him into the shadows, now bolstered by power and worldwide fame, transformed into a ruthless suppression of any dissent. He tolerated no rivals and no opponents. The Society's meetings, once lively forums for debate, became a one-man show. The president's word was law, and no one dared to contradict him. He used his position to settle old scores. When his nemesis Robert Hooke died, Newton is rumored to have ordered the destruction of his only known portrait, to erase even the memory of him. He waged a long and ugly war with the astronomer royal, John Flamsteed, who had spent decades collecting invaluable data on the stars and planets, but was slow to share it. Newton, considering the data state property necessary for verifying his theories, literally seized it from Flamsteed by force and published it, a flagrant violation of scientific ethics. But the most disgraceful chapter of his presidency was his vendetta against the German philosopher and mathematician Gottfried Leibniz. Leibniz, independently of Newton, and at around the same time, had also invented calculus, giving it a different name and using a more convenient notation that we still use today. Instead of acknowledging the independent discovery, Newton accused Leibniz of plagiarism. He initiated an inquiry at the Royal Society, where he himself anonymously wrote the final report, completely exonerating himself and declaring Leibniz a thief. He persecuted his German rival until his death, turning a scientific dispute into a personal vendetta that shamed not only him, but the entire English scientific community. The man who discovered the universal laws of nature proved incapable of rising above petty human passions, envy, vindictiveness, and vanity. He spent the final decades of his life in fame and honor. In 1705, Queen Anne knighted him. He was the first scientist in history to receive such an honor. He was wealthy, lived in a lavish London house, and hosted aristocrats and ambassadors. But he was profoundly lonely. The wall he had built around himself in childhood never came down. He never married and had no children. He had influential acquaintances, but no close friends. His only family was his niece, Catherine Barton, a clever and beautiful woman who managed his household and brightened his solitary old age. He continued to work, but it was the work of a curator, not a creator. He reissued his Principia and Optics, making revisions and fiercely fending off critics. He continued his theological and alchemical studies, but kept them strictly secret. A vast portion of his legacy, more than 1 million words on alchemy, prophecy, and heretical theology, remained hidden from the world in his famous black chest. He lived in 2 worlds until the very end. By day, he was Sir Isaac Newton, an icon of the Enlightenment and a symbol of scientific rationalism. By night, he was an adept of secret knowledge, awaiting the second coming. He died in his sleep on March 20th, 1727, at the age of 84. He was buried with royal honors in Westminster Abbey, alongside the monarchs and greatest figures of England. The philosopher Voltaire, who attended the funeral, wrote that he felt as if he were at the burial of a king who had ruled the minds of men by the force of truth, not by the force of power. But who was he really, this strange, lonely man? He was a paradox woven from contradictions. He was the last of the great magicians and the first of the great scientists. He believed in the philosopher's stone and discovered the law of universal gravitation. He tried to decode the apocalypse and created the language that modern science speaks. He was a vindictive, paranoid, and ruthless tyrant who showed no mercy to his enemies. But he was also a titan of thought who, single-handedly, did more to advance our understanding of the world than anyone before or since. He did not seek peace or love or happiness in the human sense. His entire life, from the day his mother left him, he sought only one thing: order. Order in the chaos of his childhood grievances, order in the chaos of a superstitious world, order in the chaos of planetary motion. And he found it. He gazed into the abyss of the universe and saw there not divine caprice, but the cold, flawless, and eternal harmony of mathematical laws. He did not just explain the world. He gave humanity the confidence that the world could be understood. And therein lies his greatest and immortal legacy.